Hello, everyone. As Kerry's just said, I'm the Education Director for the English Folk Dance and Song Society. And as with Kerry, this subject is very close to my heart in a personal and professional capacity. As the National Folk Arts Development Organisation at EFDSS, or the EFDSS, we champion the folk arts at the heart of England's rich and diverse cultural landscape. We work to achieve this through programmes of learning and participation, including the National Youth Folk Ensemble, artist development and programming, our library and archive, advocacy, resources, publications, events, communications, and at Cecil Sharp House, our folk arts centre in London. Our mission is to promote, preserve and develop the folk arts, in particular music and dance, provide national and local outreach services that enable and increase access, be a centre of excellence for the study, practice and dissemination of traditional English folk song, dance and music, celebrate diversity and promote equality. As an organisation, we have been working to embrace diversity for well over a decade. For several years now, we have been taking a stand against the practice of blackface in Morris dancing, and it's great that the Morris organisations have recently done the same. We're delighted that our associate company is Folk Dance Remix, already mentioned by Kerry, as they do important work exemplifying the diversification of folk on many levels. To find out more about the recent work we've been doing in the area of equity, diversity and inclusion, please have a look at our webpage. And if one of my colleagues could pop that in the chat, we'll put that there for you to look at. So just a few things that we've been doing in this area. One of them is that we've established an internal working group of staff and trustees to look at how we can embed and improve diversity within our work across all areas. And we will soon be publishing our second Black History resource, written by Cohen Braithwaite Kilcoyne, with music from Jerma Adan and storytelling from Alison Solomon. This will explore connections between British, Caribbean and African American folk songs for Key Stage 3 young people in schools. And that will be freely available on our resource bank. Coming up in the autumn, on the 13th and 14th of November, our library is holding an academic conference on the topic of diversity in folk. And there's currently a call out for papers that's open until the 30th of July. Again, we'll pop that link in the chat a bit later. And they are inviting submissions that encourage us to view England's folk traditions from the widest possible range of viewpoints. So if you've got something interesting to say, and in brackets, note you don't need to be an academic, please do consider submitting a proposal. The need for this work to be accelerated has become clearer over the past year in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the increasing society-wide awareness of the need to address anti-racism and decolonisation in all aspects of life, including art, culture and heritage. Not only do we strive to hold out the hand of friendship and colleagueship to other folk arts traditions practiced in England today, we are also considering internally and with friends and partners, such as today's speakers, what we mean by English folk arts at this point in the 21st century, what people, circumstances, histories and social movements have led to the formation of what we understand as English folk music and dance today. What is the influence of Cecil Sharp and the other Edwardian folk collectors who were so determined to document the songs, tunes and dances they sought to save from extinction? What is the best way to talk about and engage with the sometimes racist and otherwise unsavoury views of some individuals connected to the society in the past, including Cecil Sharp? We believe that only by learning about and confronting the past can we become better equipped to improve our shared future. So nearly 90 years after the formation of the English Folk Dance and Song Society, we are looking with fresh 21st century eyes at our name and remit. I know that many other people attending this event are also committed to and involved with diversifying folk education and participation in numerous ways. What do we all need to do to take the further steps that are required? So fortunately, we're joined today by our three presenters who are excellent pioneers in the theory and practice of this vital area in Britain. I know that they will help us expand our thinking on these issues and inspire us to be bold. I am truly excited to hear what they have to say to us. So without more ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Tina K. Ramnarine from Royal Holloway, University of London, to the virtual stage to share with us the benefit of her extensive and highly respected work in the field of decolonising folk music and dance education. She will talk to us for around 35 minutes and followed by 15 minutes for questions. So Tina, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And I was so happy to hear your introduction because all the issues you raised out really resonate with the points that I'm going to be making. I'm really delighted to be here and also to see so many friends, former students, current students and colleagues whose work I've also engaged with quite extensively. So my talk is going to be a mixture of theoretical perspectives, but also case studies to illustrate the points. And the case studies really relate to some of the issues that you raised, Rachel. And I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to show, and I will afterwards post it in the chat as a PDF file. So anyone who wants to download that will be able to download the PowerPoint afterwards. So I'm going to begin with sharing my screen. Can you all see that? Great, it's working. And maybe for those of you who don't know me, I'd just like to say a little bit about my involvement with folk music, because I don't primarily work on folk music nowadays, but my very early music education was with a folk musician. So it's been an area of music making that is really very dear to my heart. And when I embarked on my PhD research, I actually did a project on Finnish folk music. At that time, it was going through a whole revival process and really changing our ideas about folk music, moving our concepts away from folk music being rural and orally transmitted, and making us look at folk music through a more globalizing frame. One of my first publications was actually for the Folk Music Journal, published by the EFDSS, which was as long ago as 1996. But today I'm going to be talking really about decolonising folk music and dance education and thinking about how this relates to diversity discourses. So I want to begin with concepts in decolonisation. Decolonisation always involves thinking about colonial histories, and I think that's a really important foundation from which to begin thinking about decolonisation. It is a political and a social process, but it is also a creative process, which is where folk practitioners really play a very important role. Decolonisation as a concept has become very fashionable today. Everyone is suddenly talking about decolonisation, but actually the height of decolonising discourse was in the mid-20th century, at the moment when many colonies were asserting independence. And there's a rich intellectual tradition on which we can draw as practitioners to think about what are the issues in decolonisation and in diversity and broadening conversations. I'd like to mention one very important writer who was Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kenyan writer, who wrote a book called Decolonising the Mind. And he observed that the colonization of the cognitive process aimed to produce a certain kind of knowledge about the world, a certain kind of knowledge that was both present but also removed. So, for example, Kenyan students of his generation learnt about landmarks in London long before they had been able to see them, and long before they knew streets in their own capital city. So London was the heart of their conceptual thinking. And he also spoke against the dominance of English languages in education, English language and other European colonial languages in education. He was actually imprisoned for these views. And in 1977, he was imprisoned for his non-English language theatre work, in which he included song and dance as integral parts of the conversation. And in his prison cell, he started to write a novel in the Kikuyu language, hoping that his students would be reading authors such as Frantz Fanon and Vladimir Lenin and thinking about decolonizing politics. So his biography and writings center on decolonization as a process stretching from re-evaluations of the colonial past to staking aspirations for the future. And we can think of him as diversifying folk education in a colonial context. We can think of him as carrying out decolonizing work. But what about in London itself, the place that he mentioned in his writings, the place that he knew so well in his imagination? We can reevaluate colonial histories and power by searching through archive materials, for example, to reread them, interpret them in new ways. Or we might look at song lyrics to reflect on their representations. These are all decolonizing the mind type of reevaluations, and they've led to new thinking about imperial histories, and they've led to new institutional practices. They offer the possibility of recovering histories and knowledges that have been ignored, silenced, and negated. But in themselves, materials are not enough. Bringing people in is essential so that a broader range of voices is actually heard on the ground at grassroots levels. And this is an act of listening which might be thought of as being a decolonizing gesture. One really important point in these discourses is to remember that decolonizing knowledges, perspectives, and diversifying the conversation is not about replacement, and it's not about negating the past, although it's often framed in these terms. So we see actually a lot in the news reports about decolonizing university programs means that we're going to stop studying Shakespeare, for example. But actually that's not the point of a decolonizing perspective. More, it's about access and recognition. And it's also about the lived experiences of people who can shift our attention from monocultural concepts of diversity to a more pluralist form of knowledge making that ultimately addresses global inequalities. So I want to give a concrete example of this point. And I want to mention that in 2009, the BNP, the British National Party, promoted English folk song on its website with the subtext of whiteness. So folk song is necessarily white. And this is a political move that has been seen in other European contexts. But at the same time that Wa Thiong'o was writing about decolonizing the mind in the Kenyan context in the 1960s, in London, we can think of people like Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger, who were promoting more diverse and leftist political change through folk music as protest music. And they were collaborating with figures such as the Bengali singer Kali Dasgupta, who was reflecting on the conditions of Indian tea plantation workers and their repertoires in the Indian context. So these kinds of collaborations reveal the place of folk practices within transnational civil society and civil rights movements. which were perhaps most famously articulated by Bob Dylan in the American context. The collaborations are embedded in transnational histories and civil rights then, but this context can be overlooked by focusing on folk music in border politics, which rests on the legacy of folk expression as, a legacy of 19th century nationalist representations which limit folk music within national borders. And that's precisely the legacy that we're confronting when we're thinking about decolonisation and when we're thinking about diversifying. So the penultimate bullet point on this slide is about transnational history, seeing British history as transnational. And this is precisely where the McCall and Dasgupta collaboration lies, within a conceptualization of British history as transnational, recognizing the ways in which our history has been one of connections across the globe, albeit in the context of unequal relations of power. And implications for folk practices are immense, because if we think about folk scholarship, it means replacing those ideas that I grappled with as a scholar in the 1990s, replacing ideas of the folk as being a rural collective and locally bounded practice, which is an understanding that facilitates the co-option of folk music by ultra right-wing politics. So diversifying folk education is implicated in the cultural transitions of decolonising politics. On one hand, challenging monocultural images of Britain, and on the other hand, continuing to demarcate borders, because the very trope of diversity requires us to think about similarity. Diversity is thus not an easy conversation. Diversifying involves recognising inclusions and exclusions and dealing with traumatic aspects of history, as well as inviting previously neglected voices to the discussion. So a starting point for this is to think about how folk practices have been and continue to be shaped by the global relationships forged during the British imperial era, which brings us to my final bullet point here about how empire shaped Britain itself. And these are questions that Catherine Hall and Sonia Rose consider in depth in Rethinking Imperial History. So part of this rethinking is about how Britain has repositioned itself since the 1940s and 50s to the current day. And one of my examples is going to relate specifically to musicians who promoted ideas about folk music that challenged the national imagery and national imaginary about folk music. But I want to really outline three concrete approaches that I'm going to take to these questions. And I'm going to begin with the archives, then I'm going to look at folk scholarship, and then the third example is an example that I've done a lot of research on in the past. So from the archive, yesterday, the Vaughan Williams Library posted this notice. I was very excited to see it. I can't actually read the screen now because speakers are coming up here in my view, but the overall kind of message of this is, how do we think about the kinds of materials and language that is that we encounter when we look at archive materials? So reassessing our archives, and the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library posts a notice about recognizing that some of these collections contain items with racist language, depicts outdated practices and so on, and that there are moves to rethink and reassess how these materials are represented and used in research and in consultation. There's also an invitation if anyone wants to flag or signal discriminatory language, views or images to the library. So this is a decolonising gesture in itself, and a very, very welcome one, which invites people really to engage with archive materials and rethink in a collective way about how diversifying folk might itself be one of the cultural transitions of decolonising politics. I also noticed very strategically the image that's posted at the top of this notice. So Rule Britannia, which continues to mark things like our proms concerts. So really inviting a reader to maybe reconsider what the meanings and subtexts of these kinds of texts might be. So knowledge production in a very tangible way. So that's from the archives. My second example is from scholarship, and I want to look at a female scholar who did a lot of very important field work, but was also fundamental to the institutionalization of how we study folk music. And of course, this is Maud Carpeles, who was an assistant associate of Cecil Sharp, and who did very important work in Canada, in Newfoundland, in the 1930s, and revisited her field context in the 1970s. She held very particular views of folk music as being an example of purity. It's an example of musical purity, but also in the background, an example of ethnic purity. And she wrote about the material that she encountered in Newfoundland in terms of the singers all knowing that they came originally from England. So she was looking at kind of transnational musical practices, but really with the view that this was somehow all about Englishness. So by the time Maud Carpeles was publishing her later work, she was already out of step with the new scholarship of her time in the 1970s. In the 30s, she had collected 191 songs from 104 singers. And she had originally gone to Newfoundland because Cecil Sharp had been collecting British-based folk songs in the Appalachians, and he was interested in comparing with examples from further north. So this was an era when comparative scholarship was also quite strong, but today we might reframe that as this earlier scholarship really being able to help us to understand what a British transnational history might look like and what British transnational folk practices might look like. Her own definition of the folk was quite narrow, and she's been criticised for this. She only included British ballads and other related songs, and she was disappointed when she encountered other types of folk song. She was also shocked when a Canadian scholar suggested that songs composed in Newfoundland might be more significant than the child ballads that she was looking at in Newfoundland. But more positively and more importantly, she became instrumental in establishing, she was one of the co-founders of the International Folk Music Council, a society now named the International Council for Traditional Music, which draws together scholars globally for studying all kinds of genres, and a society for which I was actually the UK representative for 8 years. Now, I've just realised that I have no clock in front of me on my screen, so I hope somebody will warn me when I'm running out of time. Maybe someone will alert me how much time I've got. Maybe give me a 5-minute warning or something.
We will, Tina.
Thank you, thanks. So today, diversity, decolonisation and equality are paradigms that we are thinking about, and they contrast with paradigms that Maud Carpeles was working with. So paradigms about cultural purity and origins, and a disinterest in what was regarded as being non-British folk songs across the empire. But when I revisit this earlier scholarship, I agree with the scholar Carol Henderson Carpenter, who says that the aim should be, I quote, neither to bury nor to parade their faults, but rather to offer insight into their work as a totality. That's the end of the quote. And I view it in the same way, because after all, scholarship is also produced in particular social, political, and intellectual climates. And the kind of scholarship that we're doing today is also of its own political and intellectual climate. So another way of approaching and appraising the contributions of Maud Karpeles is to really appreciate that her collection gives us the kinds of insights into transnational dimensions and the spread of folk practices across the former British Empire that we might really want to look at when we start to think about diversity, diversifying the conversation, and rethinking what British history is from this new transnational frame. And the current scholarship, of course, adds to the insights that scholars like Karpeles provided by bringing in, for example, Indigenous voices from Canada, thinking about how Indigenous musicians engaged with Scottish folk fiddling, for example. So I'm thinking of scholars like Francis Wilkins, who've worked with James Bay Cree folk fiddlers and has set up projects to bring those musicians to Scotland. So I want to move on to thinking about issues. I've outlined what I think are some of the main issues for us to reflect on. Under these broad headings: equality, this dialectic between feelings of alienation and feelings of belonging, also highlighting the very important role that folk practitioners have long played in protest movements, and protest movements which have also been aimed at thinking about social change. So when folk practitioners begin to really address diversity issues, in a way it's within a tradition of folk thinking anyway. And of course, thinking about multiculturalism and how folk music and dance, folk practices broadly, are situated within multicultural politics. You can see the image here is a CD cover, the very best of Born in Britain. It's a CD cover of contemporary British calypsonians. Well, maybe I'll start with the idea of folk music signifying territoriality, which also signifies a particular kind of belonging to the nation state. And in that context, which is a very nationalist way of thinking, state discourses on multiculturalism have often focused on the failure of multicultural politics. So the failure of really beginning to think about broadening our conversation. But I think there are other ways of looking at this, ways in which we might think of multiculturalism as being deeply embedded in the deepest layers of Britain's histories, and thus being central to contemporary political subjectivities. This is the kind of multiculturalism that we search for in the archives. It's the kind of multiculturalism that the statement that was posted just yesterday about the library archive materials speaks to. And it's a thinking about diversity in relation to multiculturalism, which is predicated on enactments of equality. It involves thinking about histories of migration in all directions, so emigration and immigration. And it addresses new forms of xenophobia, which are the effects of a previous collapse of emancipatory politics, according to the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. He says that it's a collapse of emancipatory politics as a politics of the other. So the ways in which we continue to fail to think about diversity and how we reach other voices. It's also a problem of thinking about space. And this is a point I really want to take up, this idea of space, and to invite some thinking around what are folk spaces. So one writer I'll refer to is the sociologist Nirmal Puwar, who writes about the discomforts of feeling one is not an expected occupant of institutional spaces. And she talks about the experiences of hyper-surveillance, being viewed suspiciously, or just feeling that you're hyper-visible in a space. And broadly, she talks about social spaces not being blank and open for anybody to occupy. And this is her quote: "Over time, through processes of historical sedimentation, certain types of bodies are designated as being the natural occupants of specific spaces. Some bodies have the right to belong in certain locations, while others are marked out as trespassers who are in accordance with how both spaces and bodies are imagined, politically, historically, and conceptually circumscribed as being out of place." Now, I thought about these issues when I was looking at music of the Caribbean diaspora. So this is Windrush era politics, which came very much to the forefront of all of our minds with the Windrush scandal, and which has, of course, been reiterated and come to the forefront of our minds in light of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I was very interested in the arrival of a very famous Calypsonian, Lord Kitchener. He arrives on the Windrush, 1948, Tilbury Docks, and the reporters are there with their microphones. And the moment is captured on Pathé newsreel. They greet him and ask him if he can give an impromptu calypso performance. And he sings, "London is the place for me." It's a song which has become so highly symbolic for thinking about how people felt that actually they were coming to the mother country. They were British subjects. They saw themselves within the British Empire, and London was the centre of the world for them. So he really felt he was coming at the invitation of the British state to help rebuild the country after the Second World War. Later on, he recorded "London is the Place for Me." So the image you see here is the cover of the album, the CD recording that came out later, "London is the Place for Me," Trinidadian Calypso in London in the 1950s. So over 40,000 people arrived during the Windrush years. And I became really interested. I wrote a book all about this, Beautiful Cosmos. I became really interested in how these musicians placed themselves within narratives of Britishness and how they viewed their music also as being British music. And the clearest example for me, I mean, Lord Kitchener, he became disillusioned, by the way, with experiences of racism. He decided to return to Trinidad, so he didn't stay in Britain. But Calypso, which was already a global and highly popular musical practice, had enjoyed quite a lot of royal patronage. Lots of recordings worldwide circulated. So Calypso as a genre was still embedded within the fabric of British musical life. And at the end of the 20th century, the Association of British Calypsonians decided that they were going to represent Calypso in a new way. So this was not just a genre that came from the Caribbean island of, Caribbean island state of Trinidad and Tobago. This was, they said, a British folk music. Let me see if I've got that. Yeah, they called it a British folk music, which is a highly interesting descriptor because they were really pointing out the ways in which historically it is a British folk music. It draws on many traditions, many musical practices that were interacting in the Caribbean space. But amongst all those practices, there were, of course, genres such as reels, shottises, jigs, and so on that you might feel that you'd be very familiar with across Britain, across the Appalachians, across Newfoundland, also across the Caribbean. In the 60s and 70s, Calypso actually faded a bit. There were other kinds of Caribbean genres that became much more prominent. And those genres are also going through a process of rethinking what their place is within the musical fabric of Britain. But I want to just take us for a moment to the Caribbean island of Tobago, because when I was doing my fieldwork there, I went to a cafe and I was drawn to a sign which said First Historical Cafe and Bar, and it was covered with notices which outlined the history of the island's folk music practices, which had been classified by the Caribbean scholar J.D. Elder. And he classified the island's repertoires into various genres: reels, polkas, jigs, quadrilles, sea shanties, and nursery rhymes. And he noted that the social history of the island is clearly reflected in the island's musical repertoires. So the same genres that the Calypsonians in Britain were calling British folk music, in the Tobagonian context, are also being called Tobagonian folk music. So these are shared repertoires that take on different kinds of national signification, depending on which kinds of politics are being promoted or which kind of politics are being played out. But they both speak to this kind of transnational history of exchange amongst folk practices.
Tina, 5 minutes, although I hate to say that because this is so interesting.
Thank you, Rachel. So I'll move then from this example, which is, I just want to make one final point about it actually, because of course the tragedy of the Windrush scandal was that people who were British citizens became illegal immigrants. That was the tragedy. But it's also a tragedy for thinking about creative practices. You know, how do we label practices, and why labeling is so important? Because it can be a label of inclusion or it can be a label of exclusion. And thinking about Maud Karpeley's scholarship, for example, when she clearly defined certain kinds of repertoire as being, you know, British repertoire, she was then excluding a whole lot of repertoire that was in exchange and dialogue with that repertoire, which actually complicates the whole notion of Britishness. So that's a kind of key point that I'm trying to make here. Of course, new spaces. So Calypsonians have appeared in, you know, Notting Hill Carnival, the Royal Opera House, Victoria and Albert Museum, and most recently, I just want to mention this, in vaccination centres. So during the whole, you know, COVID experience, there have been new spaces for Calypsonians, encouraging people to go for COVID vaccines. So I'll move actually to the very final kind of topic that I want to address, which is to think about applications as, you know, folk practitioners, as folk educators. You know, how can we draw on some of this material? And I want to introduce just one additional idea maybe in this context, which is to think about folk practice in the ecosystem of music education or dance education or creative education most broadly. Zoltan Kodaly, he was another president of the International Council for Traditional Music after Maud Carpley's had founded it. He had very particular ideas about folk music in relation to art music. And he argued that musical culture was being built from above, that there was a lot of emphasis on art practices, but actually we should maybe think about just shifting our focus a little bit and building music up from the ground, which is where he saw folk practices being. Actually, I view both of these kinds of fields of practice as being much, much more connected as well. And that's why I think of it as an ecosystem. And even in the Hungarian context, we can think about Zoltán Kodály himself as somebody who was an art composer, very much inspired by folk practice and kind of producing creative work with his colleague Bela Bartók that really shows us this integration. But other points that I want to make about applications is that, of course, when we begin to think about the ecosystem of education, we might want to think about curricular reform when we're talking about diversifying and decolonising. And curricular reform, which doesn't mean changing everything that we have, but which might mean trying to tease out what are the hidden folk histories and how do we include more voices. And when we begin to tease out what's hidden and when we become more inclusive, maybe we can revise, receive knowledge. We can begin to see history in a new way. Another point that's very important is on-stage representations. So I've talked a lot about the problem of diversity in the field of classical music, but I think it's also something that we need to think about in the field of folk music. So do we really see diversity on stage, on folk stages? And how can that be just furthered a little bit? So all of these ideas emphasize the point that decolonisation and diversifying are not just theoretical or academic exercises, they're actually practical exercises as well. So that there is this very strong connection between theory and practice. And ultimately, just to end on thinking about the social role that folk practitioners have long played, I want to highlight the ways in which some of the material that I've spoken about is on one hand thinking about transnational histories, but it is on the other hand also thinking about problems that we have to grapple with today, thinking about citizenship discourses, thinking about anti-racist politics, thinking about the furthering of equalities agendas, and also thinking about the post-pandemic challenges that are going to affect arts practitioners across the board. So I think I'll stop there for applications. I've probably run out of time, and we can have I think a very interesting discussion drawing on the expertise and insights and experience of everyone in our Zoom space today.
Oh, thank you so much, Tina. I think we should show our appreciation. So I'd like to welcome David Brookhouse, Heritage Learning Manager at Lancashire County Council. And then we'll have his colleague, Dr. Aziz Ibrahim, guitarist, composer and educator. And David and Aziz will talk about their practice and approaches and how they're making work of relevance to the diverse communities in Lancashire. And having experienced some of their work and spoken about it and heard about it, I am really, really looking forward to them sharing their experience with us. So David and Aziz, handing over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a real privilege to be asked to speak to you all today. And I'm not sure whether I can follow the wonderful, insightful talk that we've just had from Professor Tina, but I will have a go. For those that know me already, I'm really sorry about that, but for those that don't, and as Kerry has suggested already, I wear many hats and deliver learning and education under various guises. But today I'll be talking to you as the head of Heritage Learning Lancashire. We are a county council based team, part of Cultural Services Directorate, and our remit is to provide curriculum and non-curriculum cultural, arts and heritage learning programmes across primary, secondary, FE and HE sectors. We also deliver family and adult learning, public programmes, teacher training programmes, as well as being critical education partners for a really diverse range of national and international partners. On a personal level, I've been a teacher and lecturer for more years than I care to remember, and I was brought up in a folk-loving household. I must add from the start a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in diversity, and I really hope that the things I'm going to discuss with you will be familiar to you. My specialism is learning and education, and it's from this lens that I will discuss how we've tackled diversity within sort of our folk education programmes. We've been delivering folk education programmes and projects for many, many, many years, and I've worked with some really fantastic people, including Jenny Reeves, Alec Fisher, Andy Bell, Phil Simpson, Faustius, Nick Beasley, talk a little bit about Nick later, Grace Smith, Mikey Kenny, and my great mates, Sean, David and Michael of the Young Uns, and of course, more recently, Aziz. Our folk education programmes have reached approximately 12,500 children in the time that we've been delivering them. And just to reiterate what Professor Tina was suggesting, that these are long-term projects, a minimum of 6 months, anything up to 2 to 3 years, just in a way that we can embed the learning that was required. So the purpose of this introduction, I'll be focusing a little bit on primary and secondary, and in essence, how we start the conversation and practice of diversity within those settings. So as a team, how do we start integrating EDI, or equality, diversity, inclusion? Well, this may sound a little bit sort of counterintuitive, but our strategy, business planning and mission statements are shaped around the basic concept that we work with and within schools that have a very, very diverse pupil base, which means we have to have a transparent, robust and dynamic philosophy concerning EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion. Furthermore, and it was something again that was picked up by Professor Tina there, was that we fully acknowledge that with an ever-changing populace and pupil base, that we are hugely mindful that the national curriculum doesn't always support and reflect and represent many of the pupils that we work with. Sometimes that is often overlooked, and I can give you examples of some of the projects that we've worked on to do that. So once we started introducing folk education into schools, my team and I looked at things from a dualistic and symbiotic lens, really. And what I mean by that is we planned our delivery around sort of two concepts. And first was, what is folk education music dance, and what can folk education music dance be? And using this rubric, we developed a sense of parity, which started to frame our approach. And this really became an agent for change and cultural collaborations. So firstly, looking at what folk music is, and we took that narrative, especially working with children, and this is sort of primary and secondary, that, you know, folk was from, for and about the people. And for us, that supported concepts of locality, sense of place, tolerance, identity, cohesion and tradition. And my frustration often is pupils are taught international subjects first without looking at their locality and what resonates beneath their feet. Once they get that sense of identity, then things can progress from national internationally. And it was from this premise that we developed a platform for cascading and then returning these projects, thoughts and ideas into and then back from the wider community in an attempt to explore and advocate and develop creative responses via our diverse cultures and from many, many different voices. So something we do in school, we advocated the teachers, then worked with the parents, brought that back in, and tradition. So one of the projects we've done recently is a project called Turns and Tunes, which is looking at traditional Lancashire tunes and the dance that's associated with it. And we delivered into school, we looked at break, and then we looked and we observed these children, and they were going through various different dances. So they were looking at the dances that we had taught, but then there was a range of other dances that was happening. It was that collaborative nature that was just wonderful to see organically processing it in the playground. And sort of when we spoke to in that school, I think there was around 27, 28 different languages spoken to that school. So they were starting to share tradition, they were starting to share dance, they were starting to share songs. So that was brilliant, and that narrative, and that's what we like to do, send those things out. So examples of some of our projects that we've done around this was Lancashire Sings, Lancashire Sagas. You will get sort of a drift of our headings of our projects, Turns and Tunes and Sounds of Identity. Now, for brevity's sake, if people would like to speak to me outside of this, I'm more than happy to sort of talk to you about those things. And if anyone wants a copy of anything that we've done, this is When Lancashire Sings CD and book, please let me know and I can send you a copy out to that. So that was what we looked at, so what folk music is, as a way of being able to explore tradition, identity, sense of place and cohesion. We also looked at the other side of things of what folk, and this was this moment in time looking at music, is what folk music can be. And we use folk music as a catalyst to support pupils with, I guess, universal struggles. So literacy, problem solving challenges, inquiry skills, conflict, emotion. So we started to build our content around this idea of shared experiences, all those experiences that children have as a collective. And again, from a perspective of me, of a 50-year-old white man, not by the lived experiences, but these ideas of shared experiences, which we brilliantly worked fantastically well. So our Lancashire Sparks project, and we will put a link into that into the chat if that's okay, Kerry, is a traditional looking at Lancashire clog dancing. But essentially, this was a literacy-based project. It was based solely on literacy, developing literacy, technical literacy, visual literacy. We're using Lancashire folk and clog dancing as the narrative behind that. Sounds of Identity, the project we worked with the young uns, was directly funded by the Department of Education as a project to develop achievement and attainment within literacy, using this idea of British values and bringing communities and cultural identity together. So directly saw it and directly funded across by the Department of Education. Which brings me to sort of how I met Aziz. Now, through many of our projects, I always wanted to create a youth folk ensemble, the Lancashire Youth Folk Ensemble. And fortuitously, a couple of years ago, the Lancashire Music Service fell into our directorate, became part of our directorate. And spoke to them and they were going, yes, I love the idea, let's do it, we'll have them as one of our ensembles. So we got the fantastic Nick Beasley as our MD, and Grace Smith supports that, and Mikey Kenny and various other tutors, and we started to develop the Lancashire Youth Folk Ensemble, which was really, for us, a really good step forward. Aside from that, and please bear with me on this, I sometimes confuse myself, around about 2014, 2015, we got asked to work with our local military regiment, the Duke of Lancaster's regiment. They were celebrating or commemorating what was called the Julunda Brigade, so soldiers from India and from the UK that were based in India, but came over in 1914 and fought in 1915 at the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. And they commemorate this each year with now seceded regiments, part of the British, Pakistan and Indian Army. They wanted to do some creative responses around this. So we took 130 school children to France and Belgium with the regiment, and we went to various locations that were fought in and around the Indian Army. They wanted a creative response to that. So we asked the children to create a resource book for teachers. And this was the first time that this had really been done. And it comes back to sort of my frustrations with the national curriculum, because there tends to be, when we look at the First World War, it tends to be white teenage Tommy. That seems to be the narrative and the books associated with that. What I wanted to do was to open up that dialogue to a vast majority of our pupils, that actually there were around 1.4, 1.5 million Indian soldiers that fought in the First World War. So they created this fantastic book. And if people want a copy of that, I can send you a copy of that. This is a fantastic book that's created now into the curriculum in India and Pakistan and through lots of schools in the UK. So that went fantastically well, and we won quite a few awards, diversity awards for that project. So we all had a really good relationship with the regiment, and we invited them to a lot of our folk projects. And it was from that folk project that one of the regiment saw the Lancashire Youth Folk Ensemble playing, and came to me afterwards and said, a bit of a diversion for us, but we'd like you to commission the Julunda Ballad. We've not done folk before. We would really like to explore folk music, and we started to create that with Nick. So Nick Beasley started to get this wonderful narrative with our young people, the Julunda Ballad. What we needed was the South Asian element to this, the half of this, because that's what the Julunda Brigade was. And a fortuitous conversation with the same major, with Aziz, then lined us together. and we had a conversation. Aziz was brought in to support the youth ensemble. We played at a fantastic event for the military at Blackburn Cathedral, and we are looking at several other aspects of this project moving forward. And from that, we built up this fantastic relationship, Aziz and myself, and looked in to create a musician in residency, because we shared the same thoughts and the same narratives. So I'll hand over to Aziz to explain sort of the thought processes behind what we do and his viewpoints on folk and diversity.
Thanks, Dave. I hope you can hear me very clearly. I made a little. Thanks, Katie. I made a little bit. Well, I'm an audio guy, so therefore I make a lot of effort when it comes to audio. So I've got this big dustbin in front of my face. I hope you can see my lips. So if you are lip reading, you can see that quite clearly. I'll try and speak clearly as well, because I do have this obviously Mancunian lilt, which will keep creeping in. You're right, I want mate and all that. I'll try and keep that at a minimum. I'll try and keep it down. Thanks, David. Yes, it was fortuitous, and also for me that I met Dave, and I met Heritage Learning. Excuse me, Dave. And it did actually happen through. I was working at Manchester Museum. I'm part of the South Asia Gallery co-curators, because Manchester Museum are looking at a new approach to museums and also the repatriation of objects. But part of the work I was doing there was to do with the Amritsar massacre, which I was relating to the Peterloo massacre. That was one of my projects that I was working on through Manchester Histories. And I wanted to interpret the Amritsar massacre through a composition, and through that composition there were a lot of guests, and Major Bob, as David would call him, was there, and he went away with an impression that we could possibly work together in the future, and here we are working together. I hope for a long-term basis. It's quite something for me. Let me just say that my roots are music. They're not musical. They don't come from music at all, because culturally people tended to stick to a line of work that like farming or something like that we're into, or they were, whatever their occupation was. It continues generally in terms of South Asian culture. And me to switch to music was actually an opportunity that arose from culture in England, and obviously in the United Kingdom. It's an opportunity. You can do things. You can do. I'm born in England and born in Manchester, so I'm just talking about identity. That I identify myself as a Mancunian first and foremost, and then other things follow after that through being a Muslim and being of a heritage which was continuously moving, because my parents were originally from India, and then they became Pakistani, and then they became English or British, those passports. So when somebody asks me, are you Pakistani? It's very hard to say, because I'm British by passport and born in Manchester, so I'm a Mancunian. But identity is one of those things where it's always confused me, and was one of the things I wanted to look at in terms of research. And initially that was kind of supported by Arts Council England. So I've done 3 successful projects through Arts Council England about identity, about music, with identity of music, the militarization of music, and also culturally, what's my place here in the United Kingdom and in England? Am I an equal? Or am I still, the son of an immigrant? And do I have a say? Do I not have a say? And then what's my involvement in terms of, I was born here. So I was born in 1964. So, I have this question about, I've been here that long. Do I have an equal say? Do I have a right to speak up and say, well, I'm English, I'm Mancunian, therefore, why doesn't music around me reflect that? Why is it always got to be about a kind of a role where it's to do with the stereotype or the generalization of culture? So I know I've started off a conversation here in terms of just my own perspective, but I think it's important for me to share that because I'm not reading off a script here. I'm trying to tell you something that's straight from the heart, really. So it may not, you may disagree or it may not reflect your perspective, but it is a perspective of probably lots of people in this country and of different generations that are engaging or trying to engage with the cultures here, and also the laws, and also each town and city or village that they belong to. Now, just coming back to Dave, working on this fantastic project which Dave presented to me about working with the Lancashire Youth Ensemble was an opportunity for me to work with a folk ensemble. So, which I embraced because I knew very little about folk. I kind of had an empathy towards folk because of my work. I mean, first of all, let me say that my background, if anybody doesn't know, I'm the former guitarist from Simply Red in the 80s. After the 80s, I joined the Stone Roses, which is a Manchester alternative group whose roots are probably in popular culture. Well, let's not even go into that. But along that journey, I've had the privilege of working with artists like Donovan. So I toured with Donovan for a while as a bass player and a backing vocalist, but having to learn, obviously, every song that Donovan had. But that gave me a certain education, as you well know, if you know Dylan and you know Donovan and you know the history of that. It is a great education for me personally, because I'm a hungry guy. I just love music. I don't have prejudice about music, but I am a perspective, a South Asian perspective of a British-born. What's the government label me as? The government labels me as maybe British Pakistani or British Muslim. I'm not quite sure. It seems to change all the time, and it must feel strange that. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but is it not a bit strange that your identity keeps changing when the government relabels you? So, to come from that perspective, it's very difficult to relate to tradition when you have your own traditions, but I also have working class traditions which are on a par to what would be a white person's, excuse the expression, but I have to use it because it's an expression that of identification which I didn't make, but was made through legislations passed in British colonies of slavery within Virginia and along that coastline of America. So it's, finding your place and trying to understand traditions is very confusing. But it's something about music. I think the whole aspect of music for me is the reason why I'm interested anyway, because I find that music for me is a no passports required, a medium, a communication tool, or it can be other things as well. For me personally, it's been a no passports required communication tool that I can pass easily, make friends through towns and villages, and working in Lancashire as I am currently, that you make a lot of friends through music. And when I kind of started work with heritage learning on the Lancashire Youth Folk Ensemble, it was an involvement in terms of the military and specifically the Jalandhar Brigade, which interested me because of the Manchester military involvement, and also because obviously the Indian and the Pakistani soldiers that were part of that. So I really was interested in this, but my initial engagement was the usual. It was hello, meet everybody, everybody's white. And I'm like, okay, I know why I'm here, but the numbers, the imbalance, speak for themselves. They speak volumes of generally. I mean, even if you look around this conference and this room, that I'm outnumbered in terms of, culturally. There's probably maybe one or two. And then again, I mean, we're not just going off skin color, because people have heritages that you can't always see. And I try to be respectful of that, just as I expect the return, you know. But I mean, it is about that, is recognition of respect and acknowledgement of people's perspectives. That a person like myself, who comes from another continent, or his heritage is from another continent, is an integral part of society, of Mancunian society, and then of Lancashire for me personally, because I have so many connections, and then of the United Kingdom and the classifications which were spoken about earlier about British, English. But from my perspective, you know, I first of all have to feel that, do I have an equal say? Does a person like me have an equal say? Or are people just giving me lip service? Are they just saying, hey, we're doing a project and it involves your heritage per se? But that heritage is diverse, is very diverse. You can't generalize about people. They're black and therefore that person represents the whole black nation or something, or that person's from India or Bangladesh or so forth. They just don't represent, they're just one individual. So when they're within your organizations or within your community, they don't represent the whole, but they are a perspective, an individual perspective, but they don't represent everybody. So when we're playing music and we are talking about music that comes from different cultures, it doesn't mean necessarily that person who comes from that country of origin of that music is going to be into that music. It's a common mistake that you go, oh, that person's black, therefore he'll be into this music because it comes from the Caribbean. No, because they may have other tastes, just as we all do. We all have diverse tastes. And I think it's just a point, I think, to bear in mind that a person like me, for instance, I have taste, very diverse taste, because I picked up the guitar. The guitar for me was this beautiful stringed instrument that my teacher at primary school, when we used to get free milk, that's when it relates to, because we're talking a 70s story. We used to get free milk at school, and he would pull out an acoustic guitar and he'd play Streets of London or something like that. But I was just mesmerized because my own culture, I'd never heard this before. And I never heard a guitar up close and, you know, personal, and that's what got me into the guitar. Now, all I'm saying is that my path, it came from an instrument that was new to me, and I think in general, when a folk instrument or a tradition it reaches a person who's never heard it before, I think there's that engagement of intrigue and that engagement of, where does it come from? Or they relate to it, because I relate to it from my own working class background. I live on a council estate. And I still do. I still live on the same council estate I was born on. And yet those values are no different to the values that I find in a person whose heritage is, you know, Scotland, England, Ireland, from, say, a white background. Because those working class values I find I relate to, that persecution we relate to, fighting for equal rights we all relate to. And I think that was my engagement into folk, that I really wanted to know about that side, that aspect of an oral tradition, which is a tradition of South Asia. I mean, I can speak about South Asia because of that heritage and say that I do relate to oral traditions, and there's a relationship there that can be exploited. I'm not claiming to have the answers, all the answers. I think sometimes people look at you and go, oh, tell us how, you know, what we should do about engaging with the diverse population, you know, the community as such. And I don't have all the answers. All I can say is that I know how I do relate. For instance, like this is one of the topics that I do relate on the term of a commonality of, say, fighting for equal rights and recognition, and the exploitation of, you know, working class or the proletariat. I find that very engaging. So for me, folk was one of those routes where I really wanted to explore. And being a novice, I don't profess to have the knowledge that probably a lot of people in this conference have. I just have a journey. as folk sometimes is, a personal journey through music, through these prestigious, let's call them prestigious bands of the United Kingdom, of predominantly England. But I mean, I know Donovan's from Scotland and lives in Ireland. But I have a journey of experiences through diverse bands and artists. One of the artists I worked with was the late Noel Redding from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So I'm always chopping and changing. I've spent 10 years in reggae bands, in reggae culture, in Caribbean culture, learning about the different genres of reggae. I mean, we talk about calypso, but we're talking about the genres within reggae and those roots, and it's the nature of its embedment in, if that's the right word, into the United Kingdom and into England. There's a huge relationship there. But it seems to me like one of the problems and issues I have is that I find it very difficult to relate to cultures, music cultures or art cultures, which kind of alienate me, make me feel an alien, make me feel unwelcome. It's like, for example, I mean, I've said this before, so I don't want to bore people who've heard me say this many a time, but when I walk into a museum, for instance, and people are, my friends are with me and they're saying, oh, these paintings are from blah, 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 and this artist and this period, and they see something quite special and it's preserved. But all I see is pictures of black slaves or brown men helping a guy in a red jacket with white pants up on his horse, but that's what I see. That's my perspective, is that, walking in a museum, it makes me feel second class. And I wonder that in terms of engagement, do we look at that perspective of how does that person feel the way that you teach something? Are we empowering people? And I say this because I'm probably one of the few South Asians or British born who actually ventures out of community a lot. I mean, there are many, but in general, and to generalize here, you could probably say that most communities are quite insular. They stay within their communities. That's why you can point fingers and say they're based in this area of Blackburn, or they're based in this area of Burnley or so forth. They're segregated. There are issues involved here, and I think when I say that, just coming back to that point of my feeling of alienation, that's I wonder if it's something that we have to look at personally and think about how we are engaging people, and I'm not just necessarily of color, because obviously it could be gender, it could be age, it could be class, and that's one of the biggest issues, because we know that folk or traditional folk is shrinking and it's disappearing, and traditions are disappearing in the sense of popular cultures are dominating, and that they are growing exponentially, and they are growing not just in areas of like urbanization or industrialization. They're growing in rural areas too. They're growing. They are growing, and the actual traditions, they've diminished. It's very, for me personally, obviously that's a big concern, because I'm a lover of music. I'm a lover of traditions. I'm a respectful person of other people's traditions. And I would hate for these traditions to vanish, because that although we talk about popular cultures as something separate to traditional cultures or traditional folk or traditional arts, they're actually based upon these traditions. They draw their influences from these traditions, whether it be Mumford and Sons or whoever it may be. They still draw on this knowledge base, this heritage which needs to be preserved, and we need to look at why is it that we had a folk revival, maybe twice? Has it been twice or so? I don't know, but there's been periods of folk revival. So, and why now have we not got that? Or why are we not? Why isn't there one right now? What can we do to address that? And I think, that's for me is a big question, because I have traditions of my culture and heritage that um, from my parents. Let me say that, because obviously my Mancunian heritage is something else, that I want to preserve, that I want to see. Not just I want to see within, say, like schools, for instance, but I want to see empowerment. I would like to see children, especially, empowered, that whatever their heritage is, whatever their culture is in terms of their parental heritage, that they feel a sense of empowerment, that within schools, they don't feel that uh, their culture has to be hidden, that culture of theirs is equally relevant and respected. And therefore, it gives room for them to share their culture. And when they share their culture, generally, it tends to be through that music. It tends to be through dance. It tends to be through the arts, things that children enjoy together. And I think right there, that respect base needs to be established, and empowerment for different cultures, so that it's not all about. I mean, obviously, I've learned English, as you can tell, my my Mancunian-esque English, and I hope you all understand. I've got this microphone in front of my mouth, and I I also have traveled. I'm well traveled. I mean, as a musician, I've played in places where other artists fear to tread. I've toured all of Libya, played Tripoli, Benghazi, and then I've played in Syria, into Damascus and Aleppo, and then all the way to Jerusalem. And I did all of Northwest Africa, and then through the Middle East, and then on to South Asia, into India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and shows up in Nepal. And along those routes, I met a lot of musicians and artists of their own folk traditions, and their own oral traditions, of this storytelling, this illiterate kind of base of personal stories or work stories or marriage, or it kind of represented so many walks of life, not irrelevant, obviously currents about life today. And I'm just coming back to Lancashire. I think about that relationship. Is that the same? Do you feel the same about? Is that how folk is for you? Is it perceived as representing what is current, what is happening today? Is it the folk of today, or are we talking about just the preserving of traditions which date back to whenever you want to say that traditional? But I mean, obviously, folk is confusing, isn't it? Because it changes, and just as songs within folk, they change because individual artists would change the lyrics, they would change them, they would adapt them in their storytelling. So we don't know the roots. I don't think we know the roots unless somebody here can pinpoint exactly and say this was the definitive. But I don't see the definitive. I see an art form which changes culturally with society as well, but it still represents, an opinion and commentary, or just personal stories. And I want to be involved in that.
Aziz, Aziz, is it just aware that we need to leave time for questions? Is it okay to wrap up in the next 2 to 3 minutes?
I'm glad you said that, because I didn't even have time to actually say, can somebody please tell me when to shut up?
Thank you so much, Aziz. It's very hard because I'm hanging on every word, but there's a few questions coming through.
That's very kind, but I can see a few people sleeping, their eyes are closed. I'm sorry. But that's really nice. I will wrap up very quickly. That just maybe to summarize on this, because I am improvising my way through this, because I wanted to improvise just so that you could see that my explanation or my story as such is just is an improvisation and a response to this conversation. But my perspective is probably a perspective that you have to consider in folk. That what is folk today? I mean, the communities and the cultures that exist within England, if we are talking specifically about England, are their voices heard? Are they represented? Is it tokenism, or is it an appropriation? I mean, for me personally, I'm just going to, because this is about music and about, well, it is about music. So I don't want to be all words. If I play something like this, for instance, for you. So obviously, you know, I mean, some people grew up with that band and you would say Rolling Stones or whatever. But for me, is a story of cultural appropriation. Our whole engagement of a culture is a kind of cultural appropriation and not actual respect that the black culture, for instance, and the blues, for instance. How do you ever see a black musician playing the blues? And I think it's one of those, and you do. I mean, I know they do. So in like, I know there's the Blues Festival, which I played in Cologne and so forth. But there are aspects of it where you don't see a true representation of those cultures within our education system or in the music services. Do we have the instruments within the music service to teach folk instruments of the cultures that live within our community, within Lancashire? It's a big problem that which, you know, children are still faced with tubas, recorders, so forth, abundance of them. But do we have the tabla? Do we have a sitar, a sarod? Are there opportunities for them to employ other folk instruments? I mean, apart from the drum instruments, percussion instruments, the djembes and so forth, do you actually have those within the music service and the staff to involve them within projects like the one I'm working on have worked on, Heritage Learning, and in the Jalunda Brigade, or the one I'm working on presently, which is you know, Sound of Heritage within Helmshaw Mills and in Gawthorpe Hall and Clitheroe Castle, where I want to talk about those cultures and music within prestigious buildings, which I said felt alienated. But these are some of the aspects. I wasn't keeping an eye on the clock. There are many aspects to this that, you know, I would raise. But bear in mind, it is my own perspective, but it's a perspective of a Pakistani, a Mancunian, somebody from South Asian heritage who I've learned how to adapt. I've learned how to fit in. But it's not just about fitting in. It's also about, do people have the respect for me and for the things that I bring to England in terms of its heritage and will be an integral part of its heritage, if it isn't already. And we have to move past just knowing the words of chicken vindaloo and, you know, tikka masala and things like that, and actually know something more than that. And I'm not saying that people here don't, because obviously, you know, you are people who are well educated, have an affiliation with many cultures through music and education. But society is like that. And I've known it to be like that. And I'm somebody who, you know, understands how to integrate. But it's not just about integration for me, you know. There has to be a mutual understanding. There has to be mutual respect of cultures, of folk from different cultures, our individual heritage. But at the same time, I understand. Sorry, Kerry, I will wrap up. That the whole fabric of what folk actually is, it's a beautiful heritage. To be respected. And that's one thing I do know, that individualism that comes from maybe seclusion from a small village or wherever it is you come from, without the influence of popular music, that also has to be preserved and given equal respect too. So let me cut it there. Otherwise, I'll just carry on forever and play you another tune. But thanks so much for having me, and thanks, David, for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David and Aziz. Thank you so much. Wow, that was a river of consciousness and images and thoughts, and some. Yeah, wow, my brain is buzzing. My brain is buzzing. I'm just going to pick up a very interesting question here, which is Alex would like to unmute themselves and ask a question. So Alex, if you would like to do that, please.
Hello. Thank you, well, everyone, and particularly Aziz, thank you for sharing from the heart. It really meant a lot. It made me feel safe as well in this space and to share. Yeah, I'm a South American folk musician. As you said, Aziz, I don't look it. I look Russian for some reason. I came out in a funny way, but I don't look like my father at all. My dad came over as a refugee in the 70s, and he brought with him his folk tradition, which he passed down to me, and I try and keep alive, as well as being really interested in the British and Irish folk traditions as well, and synthesizing them in my own music. And yeah, as you said, like so many genres and so many musics that are big now are developed through synthesis of cultures, particularly when people do migrate, is when things get shaken up. And then that becomes a dialogue between continents, and that music then gets reconsumed back in the country of origin, should you say. And so, for example, I think a common piece of folk knowledge people have is that chicken tikka masala was invented in a pub in England, right? And is a staple dish. But I often say to people know where salsa comes from, because people think salsa, they think Cuba, but actually salsa was invented in New York, and it's a synthesis of rumba and son that came in through the diasporas. And then now salsa is one of the biggest exports from South America, but was developed through that Latinx kind of counterculture in New York. And just one thing I was going to share and ask what your experience has been around, Aziz, is that I grew up around lots of amazing musicians here in the diaspora, South American musicians in the diaspora. I'm forever throwing parties together, organizing kind of trade union events or just festivals for each other where we all perform and we all sing and we all harmonize with each other. And yet somehow when there is space in a big festival, in a big venue, in a big lineup, and including very much folk festivals, and when there is space for some diversity or for a kind of exotic artist, often they'll fly an artist from halfway across the world, from Argentina, from Chile, from Cuba, for example, with their budget. And I've spoken about this with a lot of folk South American musicians, and this is a very shared experience, but never source that expertise, that beauty from their own community, which is absolutely there. And so there's almost this kind of fetishization that goes on, and this exoticization, this other, it has to be authentic. And then that question of what is authentic, authentic is just as much the South American folk musician who's in the neighborhood, who's been doing it for years and no one's been listening to, as it is someone coming away from half across the world. So I was wondering, Aziz, what your experiences of that have been, and both the fetishization, as you were saying, and monolithizing, but also of when there is that platform, how we can kind of start to interface more with the diaspora as it is presently.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that, and also have experienced it many times, that festivals in general, and even obviously I'm based in Manchester, and I kind of find that happens with, say, for instance, Manchester International Festival, and they have huge budgets. And obviously, I appreciate that, to give people an opportunity, for them to experience artists from different countries is very important. I don't deny that. But what we're talking about, or you're talking about specifically, is about local artists and about or national artists. And I think you're right that it's not given enough kudos, or that it's not given enough importance and budget to search that. Or I don't know whether I don't want to point fingers, because but it does feel to me that there's not enough research done into the country, into what exists, enough platform and opportunities for local artists. You're absolutely right. And I did address this because I'm on the regional committee. I was on the regional committee, sorry. I've been too busy with the Lancashire projects to be involved in the Musicians Union. But it was one of the things that we were lobbying festivals with, that inclusion of those artists is very important. And I think for all of us to back artists like yourself or myself or anybody else for that matter, that they have an opportunity to share what they create, which is probably quite unique in terms of the influences that are within this country of all the different cultures. That's really important. I think that they reflect something of the innovation, really, that innovation that exists right here under our very noses. Absolutely right. How we go about it, I mean, for instance, I don't know. I thought the Musicians Union would be one of the routes because they do engage with festivals, but I hope that maybe here there are people who have suggestions of how that change could come about. But you are absolutely right about that, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Thanks for great question and response there, Aziz. And some people are sharing some interesting resources and thoughts in the chat, which is really great as well. I am just scanning it to see if we have one more question. And Kerry Fletcher has a question, I think. Otherwise, we're going to move to our breakout room, so we can just have a few moments in smaller groups, just sort of trying to unpack some of this a wealth of thoughts that have come our way this afternoon. Kerry, do you have a question?
Rachel, Angeline has a question. I just spotted her.
Thank you so very much. Angeline, the floor is yours. You're our final question. Go for it.
Thank you. And excuse me, thank you, Kerry. That's very kind. Aziz, thank you so much. It was just wonderful, really wonderful. And I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more, you touched on the idea of cultural appropriation. And I'm really interested in that, and I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on where cultural appropriation ends and cultural appropriation begins, and so on.
Okay, I mean, it actually began with, and thanks for asking, because I did kind of glance over it, because I was trying to just give a very brief insight into what somebody like myself might consider cultural appropriation, because as a guitarist, I try, and other people who are players here, you know, who play an instrument, we're all trying to find our voice, you know, in an instrument. And it's very difficult to find your voice when things are dominated by popular culture, in a sense of the plagiarism that exists. But this relationship between East and West is what I'm talking about, and it goes back to colonialization, that I'm trying to escape that kind of connection that everybody, I mean, as soon as you say the sitar, people will say Pandit Ravi Shankar, you know, that Beatles relationship. Or they will say the Rolling Stones, as in Paint It Black, or it will be some kind of reference where that instrument appears through that relationship. Now, the national curriculum is using Ravi Shankar's daughter as part of the introduction of South Asian culture and music into the national curriculum of music. And I see, this is my opinion, but I see a problem with that again, that we're only talking about this root of the appropriation of music, you know, cultural appropriation of music, how people relate to that culture and music, as in, oh, it's that instrument, oh, it's George Harrison, oh, it's this connection. And I think it's time to move on from that, to actually look at, as we do in folk, it has such depth and innovations. That culture has depth and innovations from all those different regions. And it's time to engage in a different way that will engage children into music. I mean, I hated music, and this is the story really. I hated music at school. I've achieved God knows what in music and the bands I've been in and the discs that are hanging on my wall. And yet I hated music at school. And it was because of this kind of the music that was taught to me. And I want to see a change of that engagement of South Asian music, for instance. I mean, it would be the same for other cultures too, that it's just the cultural appropriation that we're engaged through, those things that we recognize and we keep repeating and repeating. And it's time to change that by somebody else writing the narrative with their own empowerment and saying, well, it's not Ravi Shankar I want to talk about. I want to talk about, you know, the tabla player that was with him, Alaraka, whose tabla is in the British Museum. Another story, or maybe the sarod player it was the first artist to be recorded in the Europe and then in the US, and you know there are many other stories, and that's the thing. I think what I'm saying is that we have to identify the cultural appropriation that people say, like me, would say, well, I'm tired of that story. You know, I want to write my own story. I want other stories to be recognized and in the museums or in music or being taught. And I mean, let me stop there, because obviously, you know, we are limited on time, but I hope you get my point that I see that cultural appropriation through music, that whether it be what I just said here, you know, the Beatles or something, or Led Zeppelin or something. It's always the same stories. It's time to change, I think, personally. I hope that answers some of it anyway.
Thank you so much, Aziz.